A contingent asset is an asset that's put in place by an employer in favour of a pension scheme. It sits outside the pension scheme and only tips into the scheme on the occurrence of certain events, typically referred to as trigger events. So the reason that it's called a contingent asset is that it actually being put into the scheme is contingent on those events happening. And we'll come on later to talk about different types of trigger events. So there's various reasons why a contingent asset might be put in place. For example, they can form part of the funding package in the context of actuarial valuation discussions if there's a technical provisions deficit, as is often the case these days. They can also be used as part of a mitigation package, for instance, if there's a covenant deterioration for the employer. Now, from the trustee's point of view, cash will always be king. If the trustees have a choice between a large cash payment in that circumstance or a contingent asset, then they would always take the large cash payment. But employers don't necessarily have the cash available to them to make that payment, or they might not want to spend that cash on paying it into the pension scheme. They might want to invest it elsewhere in the business. So a contingent asset can be a workable compromise in that it can allow the employer to pay in lower cash payments or over a longer period while giving the trustees protection against taking risk on the covenant for longer. Now, you can also use contingent assets for PPF levy reduction purposes. If the contingent asset is in the PPF form and it meets the PPF requirements, then it can reduce the levy. But in my session earlier, I was talking more in the broader sense about contingent assets, so not just PPF levy reduction. So there's a number of different types of contingent assets in the pensions arena. The most common are guarantees, which is a promise by someone other than the employer to pay if the employer fails to do so. There are escrow arrangements whereby cash or securities are placed in an account of the employer over which the trustee has security. At the more complex end of the spectrum, there are asset-backed contribution structures, which typically involve a Scottish limited partnership holding assets. And then not as common, but still option are letters of credit or surety bonds, which are issued by banks in the case of a letter of credit or an insurer in the case of a surety bond. And those are a promise by the bank or the insurer to pay the trustees if a trigger event occurs. And finally, there are reservoir trusts, which aren't as common, but in effect do the same thing as an escrow arrangement, just within a different structure. Now, any combination of those contingent assets can be used, so the existence of one doesn't preclude putting others in place, so you really can mix and match if that is the best thing for your circumstances. Well, that will very much depend on the circumstances and the risks that you are seeking to provide protection for the trustees against. It also depends on what the employer is willing to agree to, so it will be a matter for negotiation. But standard trigger events on all of these contingent assets are non-payment and insolvency, because if either of those events happen, that the employer can't pay, or is insolvent, so also can't pay, then the trustees are going to be very concerned. Now, there are other trigger events that can be used in contingent assets, such as funding level triggers. If, for example, an employer wants the trustee to take more investment risk than the trustee would otherwise be comfortable in doing, then you can, for instance, put in place an escrow arrangement. And at some point in the future, you would have a funding level test and see if the investments have performed as you had hoped. And if they hadn't, then amounts can tip into the scheme. Other trigger events that you can see are material deterioration in covenants. So if that's caused by change of control and a subsequent deterioration in covenant, or a loss of key contracts in the employer, you can really look at what risks the trustees are seeking to protect against and work around those. Now, some contingent assets are more appropriate for trigger events than others. There's different types of trigger events. For example, a legal mortgage over property wouldn't be appropriate for a funding level type trigger, because in order to realise value from a legal mortgage, you need to sell the property. And if the employee is in the property, then that will have an adverse impact on covenant. So it's very much seeing what's appropriate in your circumstances. Well, the first thing to do is to sit down and analyse what you're trying to achieve with the contingent asset. From the employer's point of view, that will generally be to reduce cash payments or pay them over a longer period. And from the trustee's perspective, it will be what risks am I concerned about if I have to take the risk on the employer for that longer period. Now, the employer won't always be willing to provide protection against all the trustees' wants, so it is very much a matter for negotiation. But if you sit down and undertake that analysis, it will help you to identify what you are seeking to achieve and then which may be the most appropriate form of contingent asset. In the specific circumstances that you are in, there will be pros and cons of the different types of contingent asset. So, for example, with a guarantee, it's the most straightforward contingent asset to implement. It's low cost, but on the other hand, you have to know that the guarantor is good for the money. There's no ring-fence pot of assets available to the trustees. They have to monitor the guarantor. Guarantees tend to be favoured by employers because they are straightforward and low cost and don't restrict the business, but they might not work for the trustees. Conversely, asset-backed funding structures are at the other end of the spectrum in terms of time and cost to implement, but they do provide numerous benefits to the employer, such as tax relief, an immediate reduction in the deficit, being able to fund the deficit over a longer period. From the trustee's point of view, they get access to a ring-fence pool of assets if a trigger event occurs. So it's very much will depend on what circumstances you find yourself in, what assets the employer has available to it to create a contingent asset, and the willingness of the employer to actually go ahead and put it in place. Well, of course, they should come and talk to me or to Sackers in general. So my details are on the website. We've got a lot of experience at Sackers in this area, and we'd be more than happy if people want to get in touch.